Having an auxiliary engine aboard a sailboat is a really great thing, as long as you have the fuel to make it work. Hi, I'm Nika Waters, and welcome to the Boat Galley Podcast. I'm talking about some things that you might want to do ahead of time to make sure you always know how much fuel you have on board. Today's episode of the Boat Galley Podcast is sponsored by FastSeas.com. Plan your next passage using FastSeas. Whether you are after speed or comfort, FastSeas will find the optimum route to your destination. FastSeas, that's FASTSEAS, making weather routing simple. Use coupon code GALLEY2018, that's GALLEY 2018, for an exclusive 10% discount. We certainly used FastSeas on our last passage, going from Beaufort, North Carolina to the British Virgin Islands. One of the things that it didn't help us do, though, was deal with our fuel. And yes, we did wind up running out of fuel on the way in. And so there are some lessons that we learned. There's some things that we did absolutely right, and there are some things that would be good to do ahead of time. So I thought I'd share those with you. Here are some 6 lessons about passage diesel management. These are good even if you're not going on a passage. So one of the things that you should do is to know your engine's efficiency. What I mean by that is figuring out the difference between how much fuel you use when you're running the engine at 2400 RPMs or 2000 RPMs, what speed that gives you, and how much you're using. So for us, the difference between running the engine at 2400 RPMs versus running the engine at 2000 RPMs is the difference between 6 knots of speed and 5 knots of speed, but it takes twice as much diesel. Dropping to 1800 RPMs still gives us 4 knots of speed and gives us even more runtime on the diesel. So figuring that out, and each engine should have a general list of what those things look like, but test it against what you actually find, because it will make a difference how loaded you are, what you're trying to push it against, those kinds of things. So understand your engine's efficiency. Going along with this is the second lesson in diesel management, which is understanding your comfort level with speed. And maybe this one is better stated as don't be too quick to turn on the engine. Really, figure out what your minimum speed is and what you're happy doing. So for us, moving the boat at even 2 knots under sail is moving the boat without needing the diesel. And that leaves the fuel for the time when there's really no wind and we're really making zero progress forward and we want to. This is definitely more of a passage thing, but again, if you know that you are relying on your engine to get you from here to there and you need to make 4 knots in order to do that, understanding your comfort level with speed, and that may change depending on your passage or your particular sail, but understanding your comfort level with speed goes along with knowing your engine's efficiency. A third thing to think about is to monitor your fuel level and usage constantly, not just once or twice during the passage. This actually is something that we did, and we're happy that we did. We had filled up with fuel completely before leaving Beaufort, including 2 jerry jugs that we carry as a matter of course. So we knew that we had 48 gallons of fuel starting out. After the first day out, where we were motoring the whole time because we were trying to get through the Gulf Stream, and we did successfully get through the Gulf Stream, no problem. But we poured one of those jerry jugs into the diesel tank, and then we started to monitor the fuel level against the engine hours. So keeping track of where we were in terms of fuel tank, as well as how many hours the fuel had given us, meant we would calibrate and recalibrate. And we kept turning the RPMs down low as we realized we were going to run out of fuel. But between this and figuring out engine efficiency, which actually we hadn't done before the passage, we managed to make it to Tortola, and really we were in between Tortola and Jost Van Dyke before we completely ran out of fuel. Don't assume that past weather is what you will see. When we left the U.S., we left knowing that the first half of the trip was going to be tough in terms of needing to work hard and really fast to get east as quickly as possible. It was late November in the North Atlantic. We also were keeping an eye on possible weather systems coming. And then the idea, though, is after the first half of the trip, when you've made all your easting, you turn the corner and fly south with the trades. For us on our passage, the trades just never filled in. And the diesel that we burned early on, as I mentioned earlier, with going through the Gulf Stream, that diesel would have helped out and come in big handy later as we were starting to get itchy about how close and yet so far our goal was. And this leads to number 5, that fuel at the end of the passage is golden. And this might be more of a psychological lesson that we learned. And we were 300 miles to go, and it felt incredibly endless because we had 4 knots of breeze. Literally, we were supposed to be in the trade winds, and we had 4 knots of wind. We were going 2.5 to 3 knots, and that 300 miles would have been another 4 days, 3 or 4 days. Being able to motor sail at 5 knots or even 4 knots would have felt like making amazing progress. And so we had to be content with the low speed because we had a tiny little bit from the sails and a little bit from the motor that we were keeping at really low RPMs, which meant that our speed was down. And the 6th lesson for us, and this would count for a long passage. It's not going to be something you're going to do going from, harbor to harbor on a weekend trip. But the cost of a few jerry jugs is worth the expense. And what we realized we probably should have done is to buy a couple of extra jerry jugs to fill up with diesel before we left. And though we don't want to keep more than 2 jerry jugs on board full time just because of a storage perspective, but having that extra fuel would have been really nice. Combined with all of these other little lessons in diesel management, having 10 extra gallons of fuel would have made the difference between getting in and having to tack all night because we couldn't sail in to the place that we wanted to go. The thing with this last one, though, is that you then have to be very, very careful and cautious about your speed comfort because you don't want to turn on the engine to go a little faster just because you think you have a lot of fuel left. Figuring out how to use the fuel that you have on board is a great way to make sure that your auxiliary engine is there when you need it. I can't wait to share an anchorage with you. Pop by and say hello if you see us somewhere together down here, and then we can just toast our good fortune to being in a beautiful place in a lifestyle that we love so much. Thank you so much for listening to the Boat Galley podcast. We love hearing from our listeners. We love it when you share us with your friends, and we love it when you don't forget to subscribe. Have the most spectacular week.